Hello there and good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen, to all 24 News with this special coverage over Ukraine-Russian situation. When Vladimir Putin shattered the peace in Europe by unleashing a military operation over this neighboring country, Ukraine, his justification was that modern Western-leaning Ukraine was a constant threat and Russia could not feel safe, develop and exist. But after weeks of bombardments, thousands of deaths and migration of millions of refugees, question remains: what is the aim behind this operation, and is there any way out? More questions needs more answers. The board of our guests, highlighted by Mr. Halli Challenger, Vice President of the Schiller Institute in Germany, and Mr. Alexei Valentin, an international relation professor. Hello, and thank you so much for joining us. The discussion begins right after this break. And before we go down in our debate, this is the latest update over the situation in Ukraine. The head of European diplomacy, Josep Borrell, announces the destruction committed extensively by the Russian army in the besieged city of Maripo in Ukraine as a major war crime. Ukrainian President Vladimir Zelensky compares Russia's military operation to the killings committed by Nazi Germany during the World War II through address to Zionist lawmakers. In a tweet, UN High Commissioner for Refugees Filippo Grandi said that 10 million people have now fled Ukraine and homes in Ukraine due to Russia's devastating war. Mr. Valentin, since you are in Kiev where everything is happening now, I will start with you. What can you tell us about the situation in Ukraine now? Because behind the scene, we might miss some points to mention.
The military situation is very dangerous for Ukraine in the southeast, in the city of Mariupol. It seems that there is no chance for Ukraine to keep control over this city, but the remaining forces there are intended to resist. The Russian military leadership changed its tactics. In the first days, they wanted to have a quick change of political regime and establishment of a kind of puppet regime in Kiev. They failed. The patriotic war started. All people united to rebuff the invasion. And the Ukrainian army showed that it is not the best sparring partner for such kind of military exercises. It was a wrong object of intervention chosen by the top Russian leadership. Ukrainian army is strong. Ukrainian people are united to support their army and to fight, even if Russian troops occupy the territories. And these territories, there is no supporting population for the Russian administration. So now Russia changed again its strategy. Now they try to occupy the east and the south of Ukraine in order to keep these territories later and to press on Ukrainian government to agree to big concessions, to large-scale concessions, in the first place to agree to Russian occupation of Crimea and for creation of puppet republics in the east of Ukraine, Donbass and Lugansk. Mm-hmm. So now Russia is intended to control as much territories as possible in order to press on Ukrainian leadership. But it's not possible that Ukrainian leadership will agree to a ceasefire with this kind of Russian demands, to agree to the that Crimea and the east of Ukraine will not be part of Ukraine. So it seems that Ukrainian war in Ukraine will continue for future weeks and maybe months, unfortunately. And what I want to mention, that when Russian troops advance, most of the people leave these territories. And then a lot of Russian soldiers, they are looting those
well understood.
those
Thank you,
houses which are
Mr.
left
Valentin.
behind.
We will come to this point. Mr. Halley, this is your first intervention with us. Thank you so much for accepting our invitation. And as an introduction to your way of thinking, neither Russian or Ukrainian, how can you explain this military operation that is going to affect not only Ukraine and Russia, not only Europe, but the whole world?
Well, my view is that this has very little to do with Ukraine, that Ukraine is being used as a proxy for a Western warfare against Russia and China. We've seen a buildup over the last months of tension in the South China Sea as well as Ukraine, in the Black Sea, and there's a reason for it. The Western financial system is collapsing, and Russia and China are forming an integrated economic union in Eurasia. Now, students of history know that from the standpoint of especially the British Empire, but now the Anglo-American Empire, the greatest threat is an alliance of Eurasia with Europe. And there had been significant attraction for German business, French, Italian, and others for trade with Russia and China. Now, the separate issue of Ukraine is President Putin's demands for security guarantees. And I would point out to your listeners that what Putin is asking in a demilitarization of Ukraine, denazification of Ukraine, and no NATO in Ukraine is not so different from what President John F. Kennedy asked for in 1962 when he demanded that Khrushchev remove the nuclear missiles from Cuba. We almost went to nuclear war over that, but fortunately there was a back channel established and there was an agreement to move away from the brink of war. Now the problem here is that, in my view, Ukraine is a puppet state. Since the 2014 coup, it was a regime change coup run by Western interests to overthrow a democratically elected regime. It's important to recognize that the U.S. has a history recently of these kinds of attacks in Libya, in Iraq, in Syria, where the U.S. is destabilizing governments that won't go along with the Western economic policy. And now we see them targeting Russia and China. And the reason for this, as I said at the outset, is the financial system in the West is crumbling. It's overloaded with debt, and there's the push for the so-called Great Reset, which means no sovereign nation can resist the demands of the International Monetary Fund and the international bankers. So I think that's what we're looking at in Ukraine. And the possibility of a settlement is going to come when the Western leaders realize that they're not going to be able to back down the Russians.
Mr. Halley, I'm sorry to cut your train of thought, but taking into consideration what just you have highlighted, you are saying that US and the Western countries represented by NATO kind of are responsible for what is happening in Ukraine. Mr. Valentin, this is the situation he has just stated. Do you agree with that? That US and the NATO countries kind of are responsible for what is happening, by giving examples of Syria, Libya, Iraq?
Well, in my view, Russian president is mirroring American and Western behavior in the recent 30 years. First Yugoslavia, then Iraq, Afghanistan, Libya. Well, these are separate stories, but is it up to the leadership of the neighboring country with the closest ethnic and cultural relations to repeat something which was done by others towards other civilizations? So can you imagine that Algeria would behave in this way as the Russian leadership behaves towards Ukraine, as to Libya or as to Morocco or to any other neighboring brotherly nations? We cannot imagine this. So what's that? It's a destruction of Ukrainian economy, of Ukrainian social fabric. Now more than 3.5 million of Ukrainians left Ukraine. approximately the same number will leave soon. What's that? And what I mentioned already, when some cities and villages are left by its population, then some savage Russian soldiers are coming and plundering it. They are looting. Can you imagine behavior of a brotherly nation, as they say, to behave this way? Well, it's happened. It's happening now. We should think about the preventive measures. Algeria is quite close to Russia, China, India. Can you, these countries who can talk with the Russian leadership?
Mr. Valentin, I'm sorry to cut your train of thought. By saying that Algeria is close to Russia, it means that we are helping Russia. But if we take into consideration the last diplomatic talks, Algeria is always looking for diplomacy talks, either for Ukraine or even for Russia. They are not looking forward to help any side, as well as China. So Algeria has lived the same situation with the neighboring country, Morocco. The situation that happened, just they cut diplomatic ties with the country. There is nothing happened with the military operation. So, taking into consideration what you have just said, I must say that Russia and USA, they are considered as the biggest armies in the world. So, the only thing they react with is military operation. Do you agree with that, Mr. Hawley?
Well, let me say something about this analogy with Morocco. Or Libya. If Libya had weapons being placed on the border of Algeria or within reach of Algeria and was shelling Algerian cities as the Ukrainian army was shelling cities in Lugansk and Donetsk, then there would be a very different situation. I think it's completely wrong to say that this is unprovoked. There have been 14,000 people killed in the Donbass, the majority of them citizens of the Donbass who are of Russian ethnic origin. And this is what caused Putin to react. And the Russian attempt to protect those people was very patient. The Minsk Accord was signed in 2015, in which the Ukrainian government signed it, committing itself to negotiate with the people of the Donbass for limited autonomy and taking away the anti-Russian measures. The Kiev government refused to do that. That's 8 years, 8 years of shelling and so on. And one other point on the destruction of the Ukrainian economy, I would argue the Ukrainian economy has been destroyed even worse since 2014 by the International Monetary Fund, which came in with its so-called liberal reforms and increased the poverty in Ukraine dramatically to the point that the per capita GDP is lower today than it was in 1991. So the question of the Western model for Ukraine has been a disaster for Ukraine.
Understood. Now moving to the second point, Russia has urged Ukrainian forces in the port of city of Maripo to lay down their arms and surrender in exchange for safe passage out of town. But officials in Kiev immediately rejected the offer as out of the question. More in this report.
As it continued its barrage of the besieged city of Mariupol, Russia calls on Ukraine to lay down its arms and demands a written response to its ultimatum on Monday, in the name of safeguarding the inhabitants and infrastructure of the city of Mariupol. Russian Colonel General Mikhail Mizintsev said on Sunday that Moscow would allow 2 corridors out of the coastal city, heading east towards Russia and west to other parts of Ukraine.
As of 10 a.m. Moscow time, March 21, the Russian Federation will open humanitarian corridors from Mariupol to the east, and in agreement with the Ukrainian side to the west.
Ukrainian Deputy Prime Minister Irina Vereshchuk rejected the notion, saying there can be no talk of any surrender or laying down of arms. She emphasized that they have already informed the Russian side. Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky on Sunday denounced a new act of terror after the bombing of a school in Mariupol and said he wanted to negotiate directly with Vladimir Putin.
In the besieged city of Mariupol, a Russian plane dropped a bomb on an art school. People were hiding there from shooting and shelling. There were no military positions there. There were about 400 civilians, mainly women, children, and elderly people. They are under the rubble now.
The fall of Mariupol would allow Russian forces in southern and eastern Ukraine to link up, but Western military analysts say that even if the surrounded city is taken, the troops battling a block at a time for control may be too down to help secure Russian breakthroughs on other fronts.
Mr. Hali, coming back to you again, logically speaking, surrendering now before time is late and before losing more lives is the best choice for Ukrainian soldiers as well as citizens in Mariupol. So why they refuse? And what do you think about that, taking into consideration nothing left to fight for in this city precisely?
Well, there was an interesting point raised the other day when President Zelensky said he now realizes that Ukraine will not go into NATO and he should go ahead and negotiate with the people in the Donbass. Had he said that 4 weeks ago, these special military operations launched by Moscow may not have happened. So the question is, why was he unwilling to say that? When he ran for president in 2019, he said that he would negotiate, he would go to Donbass, he would reach an agreement according to Minsk II. And neo-Nazis in the Ukrainian Defense and Security Forces, especially a man named Dmitry Yadosh, who's an advisor to a former defense minister of Ukraine, said that if Zelensky abides by the Minsk reforms, he'll be found hanging on a tree in central Kiev. So I think there's enormous pressure on President Zelensky. And I think the question is not Ukraine versus Russia, it's the West, it's the British and the Americans who are trying to impose an imperial dictate called the rules-based order or a unipolar order. And the Russians won't have it. To me, the tragedy in Ukraine is that the people of Ukraine, who are good people, are the victims of this Western drive against Russia. Even before Russia moved into Ukraine, Biden was saying, we will punish Russia and destroy its economy. So I think you have to look at the bigger picture.
It's all about Russia. Mr. Valentin, what is special about this city, Mariupol? Because it costs Ukraine's army an arm and a leg. But at the end, it has been taken almost by the majority of the Russian forces. What is special about this city?
This is a very special city in Ukraine with Russia culture, with traditional industrial culture. And 8 years ago, after the Ukrainian revolution, which was by its positions pro-Western, majority of the city was not supporting the revolution, and they were even protesting against Ukrainian army entering there. And they voted, many of them voted in support of separatists, 8 years ago. Now Russian army comes, and absolute majority of the population is against the intervention. And Russian army creates such a situation when their houses are destroyed. The majority of the Ukrainian army, which is there in the city, are very ideologized battalions of Azov. And Russian military commanders and Russian commentators said that there will be no, so they will not save the lives of these ideologized soldiers. Well, some of them, they are prisoners of war and their lives are preserved. But these ideologized Ukrainian soldiers and officers, they are ready to fight till the last of them. And because also they know there will be no mercy towards them. But there is no mercy towards Ukrainian ordinary citizens who speak the same language as the citizens of the Russian Federation. What's that? For Algerians, I would say, if your leadership would decide to save Sahrawi, come there to Western Sahara and loot the properties of Sahrawi, destroy their economy and so on, what would be that? So it reminds this situation, incredible, when somebody comes as if to save and destroy your economy, takes your life, pushes you to exile. So something really incredible happens in Ukraine. And definitely Mariupol will fall in the Russian army hands, because not enough those who fight with them there, and Russia has bigger capacity. And they will start onslaught on other East Ukrainian territories. What was there in Eastern Ukraine 8 years ago? It's not the situation now. All Ukrainians want to stop war, to take Russian forces away. And for that, it is necessary to have not only peace, but also to have now, during the war, to have some kind of interim arrangements. I mentioned to you looting of property. What can be done? Some interim arrangements with presence of such forces of observers as from Algeria, from China, from India. People are suffering now during the war and after the territory is occupied by Russians. So please, let Russian leadership know that it should be stopped. We will have peace at any moment
Mr. Valentin,
soon, but we need to preserve industrial capacity there and conditions for people's lives.
Sorry to cut your train of thought, but the solution has been given. Let's stop this military operation. I mean, surrender, and we will go for negotiations. But rather, Ukrainians are still stubborn. And to this point, Ukrainian President Vladimir Zelensky calls for peace again and urges talks, saying that negotiations are neither easy nor pleasant, but they are necessary because lives are at stake.
I'm sure you understand that negotiations are not easy and pleasant, but they are necessary because lives are at stake. Ukraine has always sought a peaceful solution, and what we want mostly today is peace, because we count every victim. For us, every family destroyed and every house ruined is too much.
Mr. Harley, people are dying. Ukraine is being destroyed every day, but nothing appears to the surface. I mean, directly. Don't you think that NATO and the US refusal to engage in serious negotiation is not really based on a defense of Ukraine's sovereignty, but only to provide more excuses for economic sanctions against Russia? Because critics and some investigations said that this list of sanctions imposed on the Russian economy has been prepared before the military operation take place.
I think you're absolutely right about that. And I think as the professor talked about the ideologized forces in Mariupol, he's talking about the Azov battalion. These are open neo-Nazis who trace their heritage back to the Galician SS. Their ancestors fought alongside the Nazis to kill Hungarians, Poles, Romanians, and Jews in Ukraine. So we're talking about forces that are a threat to the Russian population. But I think the point here then is that a peace agreement could be reached if there would be an agreement that there would be no membership offered to Ukraine for NATO, which President Zelensky has said now he's willing to accept. So what's holding it back? Well, this is where you see from the beginning, it was NATO that was interested, and the United States especially, committed to stop a Russia-China alliance. Remember, February 4th, Putin and President Xi Jinping of China met in Beijing and mapped out a major agreement for economic integration of Eurasia with China. This is the potential to begin a new financial system. The Saudis are now talking about taking yuan, the Chinese currency, for oil. There are moves of many countries, including India, Pakistan, away from the dollar system, which has not benefited most of the world, but benefits mostly the billionaire bankers of Wall Street and the City of London. So I think you have to look at the fact that Ukraine and the Ukrainian people are the victims of this Anglo-American war drive to destroy Russia, which they tried to do during the 90s under Yeltsin, but have been unable to do since Putin has come in and restored a certain amount of strength to the Russian economy and military.
Mr. Valentin, it appears that Ukraine's solution lies down in Ukraine's authorities. In other words, Ukraine's President Vladimir Zelensky. What can you say about that? And what is your expectation from this speech of Zelensky?
One clause to continue the previous ideas expressed by my colleague. I would say that the threat to Russian population, to Russian-speaking population in Ukraine is the same as the threat to Ukrainian-speaking population. Now it's Russian army and irresponsible behavior of its leadership who destroy economy, who takes Ukrainian citizens' lives. Now the war should be stopped. Russian leadership cannot achieve its goals when it antagonized all Ukrainian population towards Russian leadership. There are no those who would support what was 8 years ago when some people were ready to vote for separatists, or like in Crimea, many people voted to join Russia. It cannot happen now. There is hatred towards what was happening, is happening now. So the way to have a peaceful solution is first to stop military activities, start discussing a fair resolution of this conflict.
Mr. Valentin, taking into consideration what our colleague said, Mr. Halley, is saying that Ukraine has been sacrificed to put sanctions on Russia. Ukraine is only a tool to put sanctions on Russia. Do you agree with that?
It seems as a very valid concept. It should be taken into account. Yes, Ukraine is the country towards which there was no pity. Okay, destroy it, to destroy Russia as well. It was a trap for Russian leadership. Ukraine is not included into Western systems of defense, into protection of population. Yeah, the world is sacrificing Ukraine, and some out of there take advantage towards Russian population, future of Russian civilization, when it becomes a rogue state. It's the biggest blow on the multi-polar world, definitely. But we can trace problems towards Ottoman Empire, Roman Empire, and so on. Now I want to concentrate on the present situation. It's necessary first to stop war, and it's necessary to protect population and property in the territory occupied by Russia.
This is right.
It should be taken to their consideration to top authorities in Russia, and international protection should be given to those who are occupied and to those who have to flee from Ukraine.
The war as this military operation will only stop with diplomacy. Germany, which relies heavily on Russian gas, has major concerns over securing supplies for next winter and is doing all it can to secure alternatives. Minister for Economic Affairs Robert Hadbeck said that Saturday, saying that if we do not obtain more gas next week, or rather next winter, and if deliveries from Russia were to be cut, then we would not have enough gas to heat all our houses and keep all our industry going.
This means that if we don't get more gas by the next winter, and the supply connections from Russia would be cut off or torn down, we would not have enough gas to keep all houses warm and all industry running. So gas is mainly used in industry at the beginning of the supply chains, and then there is a kind, or there can be a kind, of domino effect.
Mr. Halley, listen to the words of Minister of Economic Affairs Robert Hadbeck in Germany. If we do not obtain more gas next winter, and if deliveries from Russia were to be cut, then we would not have enough gas to heat all our houses and keep all our industry going. How can you explain what he is saying? Is the German economy paralyzed already, or this is just a warning and preparation for German citizens to be ready for the coming days?
Well, what he's saying is true. I can tell you, as someone who lives in Germany, our utility bills are up 40%, even before anything happened with Russia. And the reason for that is that the German government has adopted a green agenda, shutting down nuclear power, moving out of coal. Now they're trying to move out of oil and gas, and solar and wind power will not provide enough energy. But there's this great transition going on from the West to shut down physical economy, economic development, and to move into a new kind of colonialism. Now, this is an important point because The German population initially was very much in favor of a negotiated settlement. The unwillingness to negotiate was not from the Russians. As I said, the Russians have been trying to negotiate with the West for years and had no positive response coming from any of the US administrations or the NATO governments. So what President Putin said, and I think he's right about this, the problems of electricity and energy in Europe are the responsibility of the European Union, which instead is talking about putting miles and miles of solar panels in Africa, in a sense, stealing the sunshine from Africa to produce electricity in Europe. We're dealing with a collapsing empire, a collapsing unipolar empire. And to go back to this question of the damage being done to Ukraine, where were the voices when the US was leveling cities in Iraq? Where were the voices when the Libyan government was destroyed? When the Syrian population was being destroyed by terrorists who were armed and trained by the CIA? I didn't hear it. The same people who did that to those countries are the ones who are trying to do it to Russia using Ukraine as a tool. And I think in Germany, we're going to see a reaction against this eventually, assuming the German people ever stand up for their own sovereignty.
Mr. Valentin, what Mr. Haley has just said is quite interesting, and somehow it's quite true. Do you agree with that? That kind of US and CIS and all those agencies are responsible for what is happening now in Russia as well as in Ukraine, because they have done this before?
Well, responsible is the world community in general, each party involved in the conflict from the West and from the East. But what is important now, what can be done at this moment? The Western societies, Western states, show their solidarity with Ukrainians. They are very generous. They are providing support for Ukrainian refugees. They are providing support, humanitarian aid to Ukrainian citizens in Ukraine. They are providing assistance to Ukrainian defenders of their country. But they are unwilling to provide the full-fledged protection. If one of the way of protection is the threat of a third world war. Not Russia can threaten it, but also the West, and it may stop. Yeah, the West is not ready for that, but it is much better. I just put it as a theoretical solution. Another solution is peaceful initiatives. How to stop war and also what to do at this moment. How the rules of the war can be established. How not to destroy economic potential, not to destroy depots of food, it's destroyed. How not to destroy possibilities for future agricultural production in Ukraine. Now we may face a hunger threat if we do not start agricultural work in spring.
Well, this is the collateral damage of each military movement all over the world. Now we will come to this point. And according to Slovakia's defense minister, the Patriot air defense system has begun arriving in Slovakia from NATO partner nations, and the deployment will continue in the next days. The system will be operated by German and Dutch troops and will be first stationed at the Silak airfield in central Slovakia to aid NATO's eastern flank defense. Mr. Hawley, as a direct question, Germany, in one hand, is trying to help Ukraine with all what it had, and now even participating with its troops, but on the other hand, they are looking forward to find a common ground with the Russians, not to cut off the gas supplies. Isn't that sort of contradiction?
Well, I want to go back to this question of how to show solidarity with Ukraine. The West should tell the Ukrainians to meet the requests of the Russians to admit that they will not be going to NATO, will not accept offensive weapons from NATO on their grounds, and will do something to rein in the important groups such as the Azov Battalion and the Pravi Sector and the other extreme neo-Nazi movements inside Ukraine. Were they to do that, the peace settlement would take place very quickly. The German government and the French government, when Macron and Chancellor Scholz met with Putin, they said they would talk to Zelensky about it, but they were never able to. This never really took place. I'm not sure why, but I think the reasonable thing to do is to get a ceasefire and move toward those agreements. It doesn't hurt Ukraine to not have Western offensive weapons on Ukraine, especially if they get a guarantee from Russia, because what Putin said is we need security guarantees for all parties. Now, my organization is calling for an international conference to take up this question of a new security architecture for the whole world, which is based on the idea of no intervention in internal affairs in other countries.
Mr. Valentin, you as a PhD political analyst or professor in international relations, how can you explain the deployment of troops in Slovakia by NATO countries, whereas politicians and diplomats are looking forward for solutions? In other words, what is happening? Is Ukraine going to be the battlefield of World War III? Will you accept this as Ukrainian?
Well, I don't think that there are many people who are ready to accept Third World War solution. But Russian leader several times was threatening with that. So why not the West cannot act as it acted in Kosovo or in Bosnia and sending de facto its troops there to Western Ukraine and protect that territory. This is one of the solutions of the Bosnia-Herzegovina type, or to find other approaches. When Russia is demanding from Ukraine some kind of solutions, ideological approaches may be accepted, like de-ideologize its Ukrainian political system, decentralize, and so on. But Russia demands ceding Ukrainian territories to Russia and to separatist status. It would be as if America, the United States in Iraq, would say, you must recognize Kurdistan and independent state. They didn't dare. They were doing a lot in order to provide for de facto independence of Kurdistan, but not legal status. And if they would say, well, we would like Basra to be part of the United States or of Britain as it was before. No, they were not doing. Russia is behaving in a very clumsy way when it imitates the Western approaches. Russia is doing in a non-professional way, and it doesn't have enough of soft power in order to create puppet proxy regimes. America and the West were able to. In Ukraine, Russia fails with this. So at the moment, it's necessary to find peaceful approach from the part of the way of the West and from Russian part and from Ukrainian.
Okay. Mr. Halley, how do you consider China opposition, or let me say China position in this conflict between Russia and Ukraine, taking into consideration that somehow they are considering China as an ally with Russia?
What the Chinese are saying is two things. First, they agree that Putin's legitimate concerns should be addressed. At the same time, they're calling for peaceful settlement. The Chinese have no interest in a militarized, expanding Russia. But I want to say something about this. I don't think Putin wants to take over Ukraine. Putin waited for many years before he did anything on eastern Ukraine. The Russians provided a certain amount of weapons to the people of the Donbass, but they didn't move in troops. They didn't annex it. There were moves in the Russian parliament calling for it to be annexed, and Putin rejected that. I think the idea here of the Chinese is that there can be a solution, but China is more concerned with the fact that the U.S. is trying to build up an Asian NATO to contain China. And that's why they're interested in what's happening in Ukraine and why they're going to continue to support Russia.
Thank you so much. Mr. Valentin, Mr. Halley has just said something very, very important. Putin could have done this years ago. Why he would wait all this time? Taking into consideration that the U.S. as well as the Western countries were trying their best to push forward the escalation.
Well, it seems now that the escalation is the path for the coming weeks. Ukraine cannot accept demands to cede territory, and there is no way how to avoid military actions in this way. So what is necessary now as an interim steps, it's arranging international agreement with Russia on military crimes.
I'm sorry to stop you over there, Mr. Valentin. Thank you so much for these points, but we have reached the limits of our show. Thank you so much, Mr. Howley, Mr. Valentin. I really appreciate always your presence. Thank you so much for being with us. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you so much for watching our TV special coverage, and now stay tuned for our English news bulletin. Bye-bye.